poetry pharmacy, poetic prescriptions for when only a poem will do. Please join your hands together and welcome Tishani Doshi and William Sieghart.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming to our session today. My name is William Sieghart. I discovered poetry, like a lot of people do, in a time of great need in my life. I was a small boy, and my parents did something very strange. They sent me to boarding school the other side of the country when I was 8. And it's a very strange British habit to send children away the other side of the country to a place where no one loves them. It's an odd parental choice, but there we go. And being a small and rather lonely individual there, the only thing that the school thought I was any good at was reading poems aloud, and I won a prize or two. And poetry, therefore, became my friend, my companion in those difficult hours. And as I grew up and got older, a wonderful English teacher demystified T.S. Eliot for me, and after that, poetry was really in my soul. When I was in my early 20s, I had my first poetry pharmacy moment. I was crossing a main road in London, and I was waiting for the lights to change, and the man standing next to me walked into the street when the light turned red, but unfortunately a driver decided to get through that red light, and the next thing I knew, I was witnessing the most shocking and sickening moment of my life, as the man was pummeled by metal, horrible screeches and noises and brake sounds, and suddenly this man was lying on the tarmac in front of me, covered in blood. Luckily in the crowd was a first aider, and he grabbed my arm, and we went and found this man who had lost his pulse, and he gave him the kiss of life, and astonishingly the pulse began to faintly return. Next thing I knew, there was an ambulance, there were police, there were statements, and then in seemingly just a few moments, everyone was gone, the traffic was flowing, I was standing where I'd begun, and the only evidence I had of this incredibly shocking experience was that I had blood on my hands. But I had learnt a poem by a poet called Philip Larkin, and he wrote a poem many years ago called Ambulances, all about how you feel when you see the ambulance pull up in your street and take your neighbor away, and what it does, that alarming thing it does to you, and you sense the solving emptiness that lies just under everything that we do, and for a moment get it whole, so permanent and blank and true. And as you see the stretcher disappear in the ambulance and the fastened doors recede, poor soul, you whisper, at your own distress. For borne away in deadened air may go the sudden shut of loss, round something nearly at an end, and what cohered in it across the years, the random blend of families and fashions, there at last begins to loosen. Inside a room the traffic parts to let go by, brings closer what is left to come, and dulls to distance all we are. Now, that piece of poetry and the very large gin and tonic that I bought, thank you, in the pub, helped me, I realized, process what had been the most shocking thing I'd ever experienced before. And as I grew older and I went into publishing, I found myself starting a poetry prize, a thing called the Forward Prize, which is Britain's biggest prizes for poetry. And I make an anthology every year called the Forward Book of Poetry, so you can find out, the best contemporary verse. And then a year or two later, I started a thing called National Poetry Day, which is 25 years old this year, and a chance for the nation to be poetic without being Anglo-Saxon and shy. You know what the Brits are like. If you were Irish, you could belt out a poem in a bar and people would buy you a drink. You do that in London, things could go horribly wrong. So National Poetry Days is a way of allowing British people to get in touch with poetry, which actually the Brits love poetry. It's like pushing at an open door. They buy more greetings cards than anyone else. They love it, but they're just a bit embarrassed about it. Anyway, years later, and the Olympics come to London in 2012, and it was apparent that even though some money was going to be spent on culture with the Olympics, poetry didn't get a look in. And so I approached the Olympic authorities and I said, I hope you understand that when the ancient Greeks invented the Olympics, they had two stadiums, one for the athletes and one for the poets. And it wasn't as though we were going to get one in London for the poets, but at least it seemed appropriate that Britain's greatest cultural export to the world, its language, should be celebrated at our great sporting moment. And delightfully, out of that, Faber and Faber asked me to make a book of poetry of my favourite poems, which I edited, called Winning Words. And once I had this book, I suddenly found myself going on tour, as writers do, to wonderful festivals such as this. And one day I'm in England and I get a phone call from a dear friend, and she said, I'm programming a festival in the west of England, in Cornwall, and she said, you're always sending me poetry to help me, to cheer me up. Her father had died, she got divorced, and she said, I'm going to set you up and you're going to do your talk, and afterwards I'm going to put you in a tent with 2 armchairs and a prescription pad, which I have designed and printed for you. You must bring every poem that you know, copies of them, that you think might help people for any particular condition or problem, and off we go. She put a blackboard outside the tent, and people could book 10 or 15-minute slots to come and tell me their worries. And I thought I would be there for an hour or so, and it was an entertaining festival gimmick. Little did I know that my life was about to change rather dramatically. 6 hours later, with a very full bladder and a rumbling tummy, I just popped my head outside the tent, and what did I see? But an enormous queue. And I realized that my wonderful friend Jenny, after I'd spent a lifetime trying to make Poetry Corner a little bit bigger, had suddenly opened an extraordinary door for people. People who loved the idea of poetry, but were intimidated by it, frightened by it, saw it as a fusty, dusty, back of a bookshop, slim volume of elite something that wasn't for them. Suddenly, poetry was accessible because it was a connection to them and how they felt. And I've always known that to some extent the key to poetry is the context, but it hadn't occurred to me before that the context should begin where we all begin, which is in our own heads and in our own psyches. And the key to all of this is complicity. I think that what makes poetry so powerful for people is when they get a sense of complicity with how they feel, expressed rather more elegantly than they can express themselves. And then they feel understood. They're not mad. Other people feel like this, have felt about this, and may have felt about this for hundreds of years. The British writer Alan Bennett put it rather beautifully, I think, and I quote, "The best moments in reading are when you come across something, a thought, a feeling, a way of looking at things, which you had thought special and particular to you. Now here it is, set down by someone else, a person you have never met, someone even who is long dead, and it is as if a hand has come out and taken yours." Isn't that beautiful? So I left Cornwall, rather amazed by this experience, and then I got signed up to do it on BBC Radio a couple of times and in the Guardian newspaper, and then for my sins I was asked by the UK government to do a public review of the future of the public library system, which is creaking and in trouble. And I spent 18 months of my life visiting libraries. But I didn't want to be the government inspector, so I offered to do a poetry pharmacy in every library I visited. And over that period, I listened to over 1,000 people's problems, one-on-one, and had the most extraordinary, humbling, sometimes extremely depressing experience. But I learned something very valuable. We're all the same. And whether I was in a leafy suburb of Kensington in London, or one of the toughest council estates in Liverpool. So many of the same issues kept coming up over and over and over again. And do you know what's the most predominant issue of all? Loneliness, which I found absolutely gripping. We live in a culture, in a society, in a technology-based world where we have so many platforms and ways of communicating with each other. It seems strange that we all feel so lonely. But I think we feel so lonely because of this. We feel lonely because we're not putting our real selves on social media. We're putting an avatar of ourselves. Nobody's going on Instagram saying, I'm lonely, I need a hug, I'm depressed, I want friends. It's all full of smiles and likes and glamour. And what's so weird is even though we see through our own avatar, we don't see through everybody else's. So all these other people make us feel socially inadequate and isolated. And I found 4 lines of poetry written 700 years ago by one of the greatest poets the world has ever seen, Hafez, from Shiraz. And he said, I wish I could show you, when you're lonely or in darkness, the astonishing light of your own being. Thank you. And I print it out, I give it to people, I say, learn it off by heart, stick it on your mirror. And I got a beautiful email from a woman saying, you won't remember me, but you visited a mental health unit in the north of Yorkshire where I was, and you gave me this piece of poetry, and last night I came home and a burglar, a robber, had come into my apartment, and he had stolen things, and he, like they do, everything had been ransacked, everything was a mess. She said, the only thing that had not moved were those 4 lines of Hafez stuck on my mirror as you told me to. Thank you, she said. It got me through the night. Now with me is one of India's most important poets and winner of my wonderful Forward Prize in England, Tishani Doshi, who has accompanied me. Yes, please, thank you. Not only a great poet, but a great dancer, if you didn't know that. And has accompanied me and was there with her husband, Carlo, the very day I gave my first pharmacy. So I'm delighted to have her on stage because she's going to read from the poetry Pharmacy. And I'm just going to tell you a story to build up, but we're going to do Hafez is It Happens All the Time in Heaven. So last year I was in London. I was doing a pharmacy in an office building all afternoon to fairly young people, and halfway through, at 3:30, the security guard for the building came in and he said, your 3:30 is cancelled. And I said, okay. And he said, can I take their place? And I said, of course, please sit down. What's on your mind? He said, I'm very troubled, he said, because I'm 32 years old. I came out when I was 24 years old, but I still have not had a relationship. And I said, that's tragic, that's really sad. Why? What do you think is behind all of this? And he said, I don't know. He said, I'm loving, I'm upbeat, I'm positive, I'm a kind person. I would make a good person to love. But he said, I'm Muslim and I'm gay and I cannot be both. And I said, I don't think that's true at all. Hafez, the greatest Sufi mystic poet of all time, 700 years ago in Shiraz, wrote,
it happens all the time in heaven. It happens all the time in heaven, and someday it will begin to happen again on earth, that men and women who are married, and men who are lovers, and women who give each other light, often will get down on their knees, and while so tenderly holding their lover's hand, with tears in their eyes, will sincerely speak, saying, my dear, how can I be more loving to you? How can I be more kind?
Isn't that beautiful? And the security guard got up with tears streaming down his face, gave me a big bear hug, and now he's dating. So poetry can do all kinds of things. And increasingly, what I've learned in these 6 or 7 years of listening to people's trials and tribulations, I realize that we live in the age of anxiety. It's as though the anxiety is getting worse and worse and worse. It's partly because of the gadget I showed you, but it's partly also because the news around us is filled not with what is happening, but what might happen. We've suddenly gone into a world where the headlines are telling us this is going to happen, this disaster is going to happen, and it hangs over us all the time. It makes the default position of normality anxious, not unanxious. It's really, really difficult. And I think what's so exciting to me about the power of poetry is it gives us a sense of continuity, a sense of feeling that we have, that things go back hundreds of thousands of years. We've all felt these difficulties and people have written about them. It gives us a sense of a normality underneath this increasing, fast-paced, changing and worrying world. Probably the most difficult time to handle anxiety is around 4 o'clock in the morning. I don't know about you, but I imagine most of you have woken up in the middle of the night feeling anxious. I'm told 4 o'clock in the morning is liver time, which might be a clue that there might be another reason for waking up. But there's nothing worse than that childlike state, even if it's a child in an adult's body, as you lie there in the dark, wondering, worrying, and particularly if you're a parent. No one tells you before you become a parent that you'll be condemned to worry for the rest of your life. I think if they did, maybe we would be less eager to start families. But the reality is that's what you're going to have to do. Worry, worry, worry. And I found the most wonderful poem by an American poet called Wendell Berry. And this is my antidote to waking up in the night and worrying. It's called The Peace of Wild Things.
The peace of wild things. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound in fear of what my life and children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free.
Now, I live right in the middle of London, quite a long way away from the wood drake and the great heron. But there's something about those words which I've committed to memory, and at 4 in the morning, if I start to recite them to myself, my breathing, the tumble-dryer mind turns itself off slowly, and my breathing returns to normality. And it's a poetic way of counting sheep, I suppose. But I'm increasingly struck by the fact that there is a poetic solution for almost every condition, because after all, we're all the same, and people have been writing about all those conditions forever and ever, in every culture, in every language. And what I think makes poetry so apt today is that we've all grown up, whatever culture, whatever faith, with our liturgies, our religious liturgies, filled with poetry. However, we're not so religious anymore. The younger generation in Europe, and I'm sure here, are increasingly more secular. But it feels to me that the canon of poetry has become the secular liturgy. And one good thing about modern social media like Instagram and so on is it allows us to share poetry with each other. Often, decent-sized chunks, but able to say to each other, this is how I feel, and maybe this will help you. The next big issue that comes our way is uncertainty. And again, it's to do with this whole issue, I think, of the media obsessing us with what might happen. And they don't make a headline about a wonderful thing that might happen. It's always something awful that's going to happen. In Britain, of course, it's always weather-related, because that's what the British are obsessed by. But one way or another, you've seen the headlines in the newspaper. It's not always about today's news, it's about tomorrow's fears. And I think the challenge here is about recalibrating in your mind uncertainty. It's a bit like glass half full or glass half empty. We can all be fearful of what might happen tomorrow. You could make a list of 100 of the most awful things that might happen to you from the moment you wake up. You could equally make a list of 100 wonderful things that might happen to you. It's all about the way you look at life. Here is a poem by Sheena Pugh called What If This Road? And it is my antidote to uncertainty or fear of the future.
What if this road that has held no surprises these many years decided not to go home after all? What if it could turn left or right with no more ado than a kite tail? What if its tarry skin were like a long, supple bolt of cloth that is shaken and rolled out and takes a new shape from the contours beneath? And if it chose to lay itself down in a new way, around a blind corner, across hills you must climb without knowing what's on the other side? Who would not hanker to be going at all risks? Who wants to know a story's end or where a road will go?
And she's right, isn't it? If everything was completely predictable, we knew exactly what was going to happen, life would just be one long Groundhog Day. It would lose all its charm and interest and so forth. We have to learn that kind of resilience again, to remind ourselves not to be fearful, but actually to think of all of this as exciting and full of possibilities. The next biggest issue that seems to come up in people's lives is courage or lack of. Most of you look far too young to remember a movie called The Wizard of Oz, but if any of you saw it, you will remember that there was a lion in The Wizard of Oz who had lost his courage, which is a hard thing for a lion to cope with, of course. But it's also hard for humans. And what's so interesting in the many thousands of hours I've listened to people pour out their worries, one of the most dominant issues for them is, I wish I had the courage to... And I'll leave you to finish that sentence in your own head. It might be, go out with him, go out with her, split up with him or split up with her. It might be, write a book, paint a painting. It doesn't matter. But everybody in their own little narrative, in their own heads, has some sense of, I only wish I could do this or that. And Christopher Logue, who is a wonderful, extremely entertaining poet in Britain who died a year or so ago, found a small poem by a French poet called Apollinaire, and he translated it, and this is what I give to people who are in need, like the lion, of a bit of courage.
Come to the edge. Come to the edge. We might fall. Come to the edge. It's too high. Come to the edge. And they came, and he pushed, and they flew.
Charming, isn't it? Of course, poetry doesn't necessarily have to look or come from a book of poetry. As I said, I think our liturgies, in my culture, the Bible is filled with wonderful poetry. As I grew up, I knew a lot of song lyrics. What tended to happen in the 19th century is that the poets were big and famous and important, but that was because there wasn't a lot of accessible culture around. If you wanted to encounter culture in those days, you had to go to a big city if you wanted to see some new art, some new paintings, or to hear an orchestra. So people queued when the publisher had a new collection of poetry by Tennyson or whatever to buy it. But once we got 100 years later into the mid-20th century and technology started to invent things like record players and radios and tape recorders and so on, the poets started to get squeezed. And they got subsumed into other cultures. You'll hear people say, Van Morrison, Leonard Cohen, Bob Dylan, brilliant poets. And it's true. Many poets, to make a living, became copywriters in advertising agencies. They'd write jingles for commercial radio. They would be writing even greetings cards. So the guy who publishes the most successful greetings cards in Britain told me he has one guy, and when he writes a greetings card for him, he can sell 80,000 copies of that card. He's sort of Britain's best-selling poet. He said no one else can even sell half as many. And that you may not like the poetry, you may not, if you're, snooty, think it's high-quality poetry, but 80,000 people will go and buy his card. So poetry is everywhere, it's all around us. As I said earlier on, I think the P word gets in the way, and that's part of my mission, is to make people feel friendly with poetry again. I don't know about you, you're obviously poetry enthusiasts because you're here, but in my experience, when I go into schools, it's young people love it until they hit puberty, and then something goes horribly wrong. And I think it's usually the intermediaries, it's the teachers, the booksellers, the librarians, who really don't know how to get people enthused and excited. And I think one of the central reasons is people are never taught how to read poetry, and I'm convinced that the secret to it is you must read it aloud. Now, you must read it aloud, and I mean in your head. You might be on the bus, so you don't want to read it aloud, but read it in your head like a prayer. Don't read it like a piece of journalism or a piece of fiction, and then you will hear the wonderful musicality and lyricism of it all. Now, in a moment, we are just going to turn to you and see if we can find a prescription or two for any of your conditions. But I thought just before we finish, you've heard probably even over here this odd word which is dominating our lives in the UK. It's called Brexit. It doesn't seem to go away. It haunts us night and day. And I thought, because so many people are coming to tell me how traumatized they are by it if they live in the UK, or by Trump if they live in America, that there ought to be a good poetic balm for the horrors that we're going through. And I found a piece of prose, but I think really it's poetry, written 300 years ago, nearly 4. It's John Donne.
No Man is an Island by John Donne. No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thy friends or of thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee.
Isn't that wonderful? Last night I was having a little last think, and I was going through a lovely old copy of Tagore, and I found this from Gitanjali, and I thought, this is something that I should be reading my patients, so I've got something to take home with me. Thou hast made me endless, such is thy pleasure. This frail vessel thou emptiest again and again, and fillest it ever with fresh life. The little flute of a reed thou hast carried over hills and dales, and hast breathed through it melodies eternally new. At the immortal touch of thy hands, my little heart loses its limits in joy, and gives birth to utterance ineffable. Thy infinite gifts come to me only on these very small hands of mine. Ages pass, and still thou pourest, and still there is room to fill. And I apologize for reading your greatest poet to you in English. Right, we've got a microphone. Gentleman over here, lady here.
Hello.
Hello.
I have a condition,
Yes?
and I'm wondering if you have a poetry for that, or a little poem for that. And my condition is called WTFness. And that's because the pamphlet says Tishani and William in conversation. And, you know, the only conversation you had amongst the two of you was a private conversation which was off the mic. So
You're really disappointed.
I don't get it.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
And, well, one of India's greatest poets, right? That's what you said about her. So.
I'm actually here as the magician's apprentice to read the poems. I think it was a mistake in the putting it down on the program. This is a conversation to introduce the poetry pharmacy to the audience. And so I'm reading other people's poems, not my own. I will be reading later with some poets at 3:45, which William will
Which
be,
I will be
which will be,
introducing.
he will be introducing. And that will also not be a conversation, that will just be reading our own work. But do we have a poem for your condition? Do you know what WTFness is?
I think I do, and I don't think I want to spell it out, do I? Otherwise people might get a
as
little
long
upset.
as long as we've all had that condition, it's fine. It's a legitimate condition. Maybe
I'm just having a look.
you have a look, and then we could maybe get another condition in the meantime.
Good idea.
Woman in the front here.
Feeling misunderstood.
Feeling misunderstood.
Feeling misunderstood. Gosh, so many things to worry about. Okay. I'm going to start with feeling misunderstood. And in a way, I look at this as a little bit more about how you might feel having been misunderstood. And it's an Irish poet, and he's called Derek Mann. And I love this poem because, well, you'll get it. How should I not be glad to contemplate the clouds clearing beyond the window and a high tide reflected on the ceiling? There will be dying, but there's no need to go into that. The poems flow from the hand unbidden, and the hidden source is the watchful heart. The sun rises in spite of everything, and the far cities are beautiful and bright. I lie here in a riot of sunlight, watching the day break and the clouds flying. Everything is going to be all right. Yes, this lady in the pink, sorry.
How about repression of feelings?
Repression.
Repression, yeah.
There's emotional repression.
Emotional or sexual? Emotional. Okay, page 70. Okay. This is by another great poet from many, many hundred years ago called Rumi, and it's called The Guest House. Shall I do it? Thank you. This being human is a guest house. Every morning a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness. Some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all. Even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture, still, treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice. Meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond.
Can I do, well, it's not exactly a poem for your exact condition, but it's a beautiful poem by Mary Oliver, who died recently, and I think we should read that one, and it's called Wild Geese. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert, repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things.
Thank you, Tishani. That's lovely. Yes. Who's got the microphone? You have. Hello.
Hello, sir. Hello, ma'am. I have a terrible, terrible condition. Please help this poor soul out. I enjoy writing, but lately I haven't been able to write anything. And it kind of makes me worried, as I'm not able to find the inspiration to write. So could you just give me some hope that I could continue with it?
Well, to be honest, I would prescribe you the lion poem, that one, they came and they pushed and she flew. Yeah. I think that's the thing. I think writer's block is a fearful thing. And funny enough, one of the things that has come up a lot in my pharmacy is the whole idea of the myth of the integrated personality. In all of us, we are not singular beings. We see each other as singular physical beings, but inside ourselves, there are many people. In me, there's a little boy, there's a brother, there's a father, there's a son, there's a lover, there's a sometimes wise old man, but more often than not, there's a frightened child. And I think what's central is, the best way of dealing with the anxieties inside you is to have a conversation with yourselves. That sounds rather strange, except actually when I deal with people who have panic attacks and things like that, one of the best ways of doing it is to allow the parent in you to talk to the frightened child. If you actually say in your head what's the matter, you'll hear this little child saying, I'm really frightened. And you have to, as a parent, say, it's okay. We'll get out of this situation. We're going to take long, deep breaths and so forth. I think that when you have creativity block, writer's block, you have to talk to yourselves and try and be someone else within yourself to get started again. Because probably it's the frightened person in you that's got sort of consciously fearful that you can't get in touch with the flow in you. So have that conversation, and fingers crossed you'll flow again. Time for one more. This lady here.
Thank you. My question is in two parts, actually. Coleridge said that the poet is the person who's fed on honeydew and drunk the milk of paradise. Coleridge. Right?
Coleridge said that
S.T. Coleridge, the poet.
That the poet is a person who is fed on honeydew.
Okay, yeah.
He said that poets are magical creatures.
Yes.
Do you agree with that? Is the DNA of the poet different? Number one. Number two, if we begin a poetry pharmacy in India, which would be the first poem you would use there?
Well, it really depends on the condition of the person. At heart, the way I do a pharmacy is I ask people to pour out their worries to me. And to be honest, as I said, it's a humbling experience. At least half the people who come and see me reach for the box of tissues. The people who usually sit and begin at the beginning and say there's nothing wrong with me at all are the ones who reach for the tissues most quickly. So I can't answer the latter part of your question with ease because it's really about finding the poem that responds to how someone is feeling. And whether you're in India or whether you're in America or Britain, that's central to it. Are all poets fed on milk and honey? No. To be quite honest, I love poetry and I've spent my life supporting it and the poetry world. I don't always find poets are full of love and warmth and kindness. I think it's in part because there's so little reward for poets, either financial or reputational. As an art form, it's probably the one that gets the least help and encouragement. And certainly when I give the Forward Prize every year in the UK, after 2 or 3 free glasses of wine, I realise it's time to leave because somebody's going to give me a hard time for who has won the prize and why they haven't. So I hope that answers your question. I'm afraid we're out of time now. So thank you so much for coming to listen to the wonderful Tishani Doshi and me today. Thank you very much.
What a wonderful session. I'd like to thank Tishani Doshi and William Sieghart. Thank you so much. Please note, the author will be signing the book at the signing desk. That's right over there.